Hello, welcome to my thesis presentation on the impact of trade compliance laws on the IP strategy of a company with the example of the pump and compressor industry. My intention today is to first briefly introduce the industry itself, then to zoom in a little bit on the IP situation in this industry. Then I will say a few words about trade compliance, in which I will be taking the current sanctions regime for Russia as an example. We will talk a little bit about circumvention and the resulting shift in trade to finally arrive at some conclusion points on the specific relation between export control laws and IP management. For the industry, I zoomed into the industrial pump, vacuum pump, and industrial compressor industry. And typically, firms operating in this industry are big companies, which operate mostly in a business-to-business market. As you can see, for example, industrial pumps are used in many different industries, including chemical industry and agriculture, while vacuum pumps are typically used in food and packaging and electronics industry. And then industrial compressors, just like industrial pumps, also have a very broad field of application, ranging from wastewater treatment to oil and gas industry and to food production. If we look at the IP strategy that is most commonly applied by companies in this industry, we see as a common denominator mostly the use of a differentiation approach, far more in fact than a cost approach. And even though smaller ranges of industrial pumps and industrial compressors can lean more towards being commodity products for which a cost approach will also be important in order to compete, many compressor and pump manufacturers actually strive for a value-added monopoly in which they rely, amongst other things, on patents and trademarks to appropriate their unique selling proposition obtained through innovation and branding. To make now the jump to trade compliance, for purposes of this thesis, I focused on the particular aspect of trade compliance, being the export controls, which entails sanctions and embargoes. These include typically restrictions on trade of specific goods or trade with targeted entities, which could be companies or individuals. Sanctions and embargoes are typically imposed by governments and are mostly political tools that do not immediately target competition between companies, but instead influences the regulatory framework within which companies have to compete. An example of another trade compliance related aspect is, for example, tariffs imposed on imports or exports of goods. But as I mentioned before, for this thesis, the influence of tariffs has not been taken into account. To illustrate the influence on the macroeconomic situation, I would like to briefly present the example of the Russian Federation, which became shortly after the 2022 military invasion of Ukraine, the most sanctioned country in the world. And these sanctions related both to specific types of goods, such as vacuum pumps and certain types of scroll compressors, but also target specific individuals and companies, both because of social pressure and because of the risk associated with violating sanctions. Many Western companies have stopped operating in the Russian market. In response to all that, Russia has introduced measures to reduce the impact of the economic sanctions on its own economy. As an example, while Russia typically applies national patent exhaustion, a regional trademark exhaustion within the Eurasian Economic Union, it decided to introduce principle of international exhaustion for products of brand owners of unfriendly nations. hence opening up the market for parallel imports of grey goods from other jurisdictions. The emergence of this grey market has hence been a direct effect of the sanctions that have been put into place. In addition, the Russian government introduced legislation allowing local Russian companies to copy products of rights holders of unfriendly countries with a 0% royalty, resulting in that there is but little enforceability of IP rights for companies based in unfriendly countries. Yet another effect of the sanctions that have been put in place was that the State Bank of Russia got sanctioned, which complicated the payment of IP-related fees to the Russian IP office. After initially imposing restrictions on IP renewals by US entities, the US government granted an exemption that allowed US companies to renew their IP rights. If we now look at the total trade volume for pumps and compressors in the UN Comtrade database, we see a huge uptake in exports from Turkey to Russia in 2022. Similarly, exports of pumps and compressors from India to Russia has increased dramatically in 2022. If we now superimpose the exports from jurisdictions which have introduced sanctions against Russia, like the EU and the United States, and jurisdictions which have not introduced sanctions against Russia, like China, Turkey, or Belarus, we see that the total volume of pumps and compressors imported into Russia has not changed all that much, since particularly China, but also Belarus and Turkey have been filling the gap that would otherwise have been created. And note that for exports from Belarus in 2022, no data was available. If we now look back to IP strategy in a company, we see that there are typically two interfaces, one with the external environment and one with the internal environment. And clearly the most direct effects created by export controls are situated in the external environment. But also these changes may also require a change in the internal environment in order to adapt to the changing situation. From a value perspective, it is noted that the fact that IP might become unenforceable or might have diminished impact on restriction on imports in a particular jurisdiction, which clearly affects the exploitation process and hence also the value potential for the rights holders. While companies could attempt to attack sanctions circumvention through the usage of IP assets, it's unlikely that this would be a primary strategic objective in itself. Where a potential business value could be identified would be in attempting to counter the disruptive effects in the competitive landscape. For example, by trying to redirect IP filings to specific jurisdictions in order to slow down the emergence of new competitors which show a huge uptake in production for purposes of export to sanctioned jurisdictions. When sanctions eventually come to an end and trade is re-established, there will be the switching costs for customers in targeted jurisdictions which have become, by then, accustomed to their new suppliers from alternative origins and potentially entered in long-term service contracts. Some of such emerging jurisdictions that have been identified are Turkey, India, and Belarus, but also by extension, the Chinese grip on the Russian market is in no way to be underestimated. It's in fact huge. And in that sense, the importance of China as a filing venue for patents, trademarks, and design applications needs to be fully appreciated. Also within companies, changes can be introduced, such as a screening of potential business partners in IP licensing, IP transfer, co-development or joint ownership of IP, but also of banks, IP offices, and IP firms to avoid violation of sanctions. In addition, IP rights owners should not only consider to get a foreign filing license before filing a patent application in a foreign country, but also they should not forget to get an export license, for example, from the Bureau of Industry and Security, before outsourcing, for example, drafting of a patent application to an agent in a foreign jurisdiction. With ever-increasing importance of export controls as a tool in international geopolitics, the influence thereof on the way in which companies are doing business cannot be ignored. Similarly, IP strategy development in a company will need to take into account that trade compliance related matters is one of the many factors that should be considered as an important influencing factor when it comes to international trade and hence the macroeconomic environment in which companies compete. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.